Right, hello everybody. Oh, thank you. Hello back. Well, thank you all very much indeed for coming tonight. It's really lovely to see so many of you. I know there's a mixture of field club members, but also people from all over the place, I think. So if you've not been before, very warm welcome to you. It should be a really fantastic evening, I think. The format is that we've got the 4 speakers who will all give a briefish presentation on what they've done in terms of wildlife gardening. And you'll get just some hints, I think, or maybe some headlines of the brilliant work that they've all done. And we'll then have a coffee break. Coffee served out there. It's £1 for a coffee or tea and homemade biscuits. And then we'll come back in here for a panel session. So the 4 speakers will be sitting at the front, and I think probably for my sins I'll sort of play the mistress of ceremonies to ask the questions round the 4 of them. So hopefully a very lovely evening full of interest and colour and wonderful slides. Just a very quick introduction to the 4 speakers because they'll do it much better than I will. But Mark Cocker, many of you will know already, he's here tonight with the hat on of having restored 5 acres of old Norfolk fen. So we've got that area of the country covered. We've then got Rachel Evatt, who's, as many of you will know, her and her husband Jeff run Nock near Whaley Bridge and managing 125 acres for wildlife there. And Rachel's also a trustee of Be Wild in Britain. Following Rachel is then Sandra Nock, who's got her own fantastic history, including Kew in the National Trust, but also for the last 4 years, she's been working at Nock and the garden there, and has been instrumental in them getting the gold medal at Tatton in 2022, is that right? Yes. For their weed griller garden. 21, correct, sorry. And then lastly, but obviously not least, we've got Jill Westrick, who has been gardening for 26 years at 1,500 feet. You said 1,500 metres then, Jill. Yeah, at 1,500 feet above Buxton, and has one of the most wonderful species-rich meadows up there, as well as a fantastic garden that her and her husband Rob have created virtually from scratch, I think. So we've got a wonderful amount of expertise. So that's enough from me. And Mark, I think you're first up, so thank you.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Well, lovely to see lots of people. I thought it was interesting that Rachel said great things with their garden. Mercifully, my wife is not here. She would tell me that I basically ruined our garden. But I'm here to talk about 1 or 2 species that do I ask you to turn? Yeah. Yes. I had a small patch in Norfolk where I managed about 5 acres, and I learned quite a lot over the 7 years that I had this area, and recorded about 600 species. And it's not really a garden, but I learned some of the principles. If you could have the next clip, Dave. I can't move the slides, is that right?
That's right, the battery's died on the pointer.
Yes, so I had this incredibly fertile, vigorous, wet fen, which overwhelmed me every year with growth, and I used to try and manage bits of it, clearing out the dykes and things like that, and try to instigate a kind of meadow habitat. If we could have the next slide. This was my meadow area, and I had a friend in doing this, and I recommend it to anybody who also wants to ruin their garden. But in the ruination, you can increase the biodiversity. There are about 2 million acres of garden in Britain. We have one of the most nature depleted landscapes in the country. So our gardens are really important habitats. In fact, in Norfolk, if you go out in the arable farmland, it's heavily drenched in multiple chemicals. There is almost no wildlife in those fields or even on the edges of them. You go into the villages and everybody's garden is diverse and everybody has a nice garden and they aren't tarmacked over and people have shrubs and trees and flowers. And truthfully, our gardens are now becoming significant repositories of nature. In fact, in places like Germany, they're finding that there is no nature in the arable environment. Much of it is in urban environments and cities. But one of the great friends of anybody who wants to increase, it was actually known as mudfat, and it's a terrible scourge for anybody who wants to grow grass. But if you want to grow flowers that are interested in birds, then yellow rattle is your friend. And you can find it abundantly in Derbyshire. And if you just pick a few seeds and sprinkle it on your grass, it's what's called a hemiparasite. So it basically lives off the grass, and it sort of drains your lawn of fertility. If you have the next picture, it's also a beautiful flower in its own right. And I yellow rattled our garden in Norfolk, and I'm yellow rattling. And it's a really fantastic plant, and essentially it drains the lawn of fertility. All gardeners want to increase fertility for some reason, and lawns especially. But I don't want them, and I want flowers and orchids and anything else that will grow. So yellow rattle is one of my friends. If I could have the next pic. And that's the kind of garden environment I had. Now, one of the things we overlook is the architecture of tall plants, as opposed to absolutely severely cropped GI hairdo lawns, which have some biodiversity. But once you start to increase the architecture with all these tall plants, leggy plants growing up, all kinds of organisms start to occupy that space. And spiders, of course, can string their webs. This is our garden in Norfolk, and you get bees. And one of the classic examples of my yellow rattling our lawn was that we soon had several species of ants. I'm a great lover of ants. Ants are one of the most important sets of organisms worldwide, but have as much impact on soil aeration as earthworms. If you have the next picture. I think that was a spider, garden cross spider. Another one of my friends is ivy. People think ivy kills trees and that it sucks the nutrients out of its host. Actually, all it does is use the larger, more substantial plant to act as a ligature on which it develops and entwines. It doesn't take nutrients from the tree. It can be a problem, and it is super abundant. And most of the woods in Derbyshire are absolutely carpeted in ivy, but it is a fantastic superfood for all sorts of organisms, but especially for, if I could have the next picture, Dave, especially for this guy who's called ivy bee. It was only first recorded in Britain in about 1998. It was only first found for science in the 1990s. It's since colonized, and I found a little colony of them in Westrick a couple of years ago. It's probably it's the most beautiful and fantastic bee. But ivy in late autumn is one of the most important sorts of nectar and pollen. So if you have ivy in your garden, control it if you must. Don't let it go wild. But it is a wonderful plant for all sorts of things and provides fruit at this time of year, which is the hungry gap for many birds. And the fruit of ivy is very, very important. And I saw Rosemary posting some absolutely luscious berries of ivy in South Derbyshire somewhere. If I could have the next pic. And yeah, the thing I really love most of all is bees, wild bees, bumblebees. This is a hill bumblebee. It's a parasitic species. But here's the other species which I strongly urge you to grow in your garden. It was very much instrumental in me ruining our garden. Bramble is, of course, virulent, but it is an absolute superfood for all sorts of invertebrates. And I've spent hours, if not days, scouring bramble plants. It is itself, of course, highly diverse. There are over 400 microspecies. So bramble, of course, it supplies you with fruit as well and provides birds with fruit. But it is wonderful for invertebrates and insects, etc. And again, creates a kind of architecture for all sorts of things, spiders, etc. So that's another of my key garden friends. And here's me being a friend to an early bumblebee. But, you know, you can get very intimate with the wildlife. And I absolutely love bumblebees. And I'm sure you all have flowers that provide them. But a lot of our non-native plants that we have in our gardens, in fact, whole fields of plants, very often, which are grown for their colour, especially on islands in roads in the middle of towns. Those plants have no pollen, no nectar, and are absolutely worthless for insects. And native plants are often very good. So if you're choosing them, make sure they're all pollen and nectar producing, and then you get wonderful women like this worker early bumblebee. If I could have the next one. And the other thing is, if you let the people have started to introduce no mow May, and you probably think, well, what difference does it make to leave the grass growing tall? But it makes an enormous difference. When you leave tall vegetation, even if it's not full of very interesting plants that are diverse and great for insects, the sheer architecture of it, the complexity of it, the rainforest-like nature of lawns that aren't mown, create environments for all sorts of things, and you'll find you'll get grasshoppers coming to sing to you if you leave your lawn, as we do, throughout May or throughout periods of the summer. Yeah, and you can always control it with borders or paths through it, or I'll cut it at the end of the season. And this is our garden in Buxton. This is my favourite bumblebee. This is bilberry bumblebee, which is a real speciality of our area. And yeah, I absolutely love bilberry bumblebee. So if you have plants like buddleia, it's often really, really great for butterflies. So it's a non-native species, but it's very good for pollen and nectar. Next pick. Yeah, and then you can get things like these lovely leafcutter bees. Don't tell me, well, Steve will know which species it is, but Steve Orich, but I can't. I've put it up on iNaturalist, but I can't identify it. But they're absolutely beautiful. They have these amazing what are called scopa, and they collect the pollen on the underside of their abdomen, and they're often brightly coloured like this with bands. So it's a fantastic insect. We get it all the time in our garden in the summer. Yeah, next pick, and I'm probably running over. And that's our garden. We inherited it, but lots of really good flowers, Aquilegia, the campion, etc. The fuchsia in the autumn is very good. It's not come into leaf, come into flower. And now I'm discovering through the brilliance of Helen Waterman that my garden has about 15 species of moss. And moss is another absolutely extraordinary plant for insects. So don't spray your lawn and kill off all the moss. Moss is really, really great for, in its own right, very beautiful. Yeah, this is stringy turf moss. And I only know this name because I learned it in the last few months. But this is a really beautiful species. And again, all sorts of invertebrates live in these tangled environments. And the more wild and unkempt you leave parts of your garden, particularly your compost heap and anywhere that's a side where you gather up leaves, you'll get small mammals and, yeah, all sorts of interesting things. So if I could have the next picture. And then I've had this extraordinary fungus come up, and all organisms, all plants, all 300,000 species worldwide are found to have complex relationships with fungi. So don't kill fungi. They're absolutely essential parts of the fertility and functioning of nature. And if you get them, then love your inner mushroom is all I'm saying. And that's another one, an earth ball, I think, which occurs in our garden, which I haven't quite identified. But they're fascinating things, and they should be in the environment. If you've got a good natural landscape in your garden, you will have fungi there. And of course, there are one or two species which are problematic, like honey fungus, which are devourers of dead trees or devourers of live trees sometimes. But there are 12,000 species in Britain. Don't load all your moral sense of fungi on one species that can do damage. Most of them are completely harmless. And then you get things like these little nomad bees, which are parasitic and lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. Not all bees are members of the Labour Party. Some of them are, well, I won't enter into a political debate about what they do, but they parasitize other people. Anyway, I've nearly finished. And this was a friend we got the other day. If you haven't got space for a pond, then ponds absolutely triple the biodiversity that you get in your garden. And our neighbours have got a pond, and we love to have their frogs over for a barbecue now and again. Like that, the next bit. I think I've finished. Yeah. Anyway, so basically 3 or 4 really key frames. Yeah, yellow rattle for your lawn. You can collect it in most meadows. Bramble, if you've got bramble, you almost certainly will have because you can't eradicate it. Don't spray it. Leave some of it to flowers. Fantastic for plants. Ivy, if you've got ivy growing anywhere. And what was the 4th thing? Well, that'll do anyway. Thanks very much.
Yeah, how does that sound, everyone? Can you hear me okay? Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me this evening. It's great to be here. I was here virtually actually 3 years ago. So it was during lockdown, I think, when I had the privilege of speaking to the Buxton Field Club. And it looks very different actually seeing real people, even if it is a bit dark. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. And 3 years ago, we were very early on in our journey of managing Nock Fields. We've had the land now for 4 years. So an awful lot has happened in that interim time between me last being here. For those that aren't familiar with the project, I'll just say a bit about that before I describe some of the things that we've been doing in the last few years. So Nock Fields is 125 acres of traditionally managed farmland, if you like. It's still considered a farm. It's still a commercial farm. However, we are now managing the land for nature. And so what that means is that we are on a couple of government pilots for some of the new environmental schemes, and we're exploring other avenues for making, hopefully, it's an experiment still, hopefully making the farm commercially viable, whilst also having at the heart managing the land for nature. So enriching biodiversity is the prime goal. So the land's quite interesting actually, because it was previously a dairy farm, and prior to that it had been a farm for 100 years. And before that, it was actually a coal mine. So there's several coal shafts, which are now filled in, and the coal seam from Whaley Bridge runs right up to and is within the farm. So it is in agricultural terms considered to be poor quality farmland, i.e. it's not productive, you wouldn't get on very well growing a crop. So in agricultural terms, it could really only be used for grazing. And in fact, it was used as a dairy farm. So if you don't bring the next slide on, Dave, thanks. So this is what the land looked like when we first took it on 4 years ago. And it looks like what you'd expect a lot of the land that we traditionally associate with the countryside to be. Green fields, and you can't quite see it, there's quite a few stone walls and so on. And it looks green and beautiful, but actually it's in ecological terms a relative desert. And when we had it surveyed, it was considered to be very poor, and that was the official terminology, ecologically so. And that's within the vast majority of the land. There are some beautiful pockets, some beautiful areas where it was difficult for the tractors to get to that are more scrubby and rich in wildlife, but the vast majority look like this. And not only is it kind of visually so, but actually the soil is in a poor state because of the way it had been treated, which was that it was farmed for dairy. So the prime goal was to make the land really fertile for growing ryegrass. And so what that meant is regular applications of slurry and herbicide. And what that means is that, unfortunately, the soil is very rich in nitrates and phosphates, and it's quite far from being a kind of natural environment. Next slide, please, Dave. So what we've chosen to do are a number of interventions over the last few years. And the first one, which is probably the simplest to do, is that we've let the grass grow long. And this picture is similar to the one you've seen previously, a slightly different angle, because it shows the adjacent farmland, which is still managed in the same way as previously. And you can quite clearly see our boundary with the long grass. And this field actually had been, we've reseeded this with a more native mix that's competed quite well with the ryegrass.
And the abundance in insect life is just phenomenal in a relatively short period of time. It's amazing how quickly a lot of the species that Mark has shown on his previous slide will take root, will take home within the long grass. And not just that, but small mammals, voles, shrews, mice, finding a home in amongst this long grass. And you can almost, when you're walking through it, you'll hear them and sometimes even see them. And of course, that is underpinning a lot of life which feeds off of that. So that was a really simple thing to do, but something that makes an enormous difference. Next slide, please, Dave. The other thing we're seeking to do is to actually intervene to adjust the habitat so that we're creating areas of scrub and woodland, which is returning the land to what it would have been a long time ago. But importantly, really creating that rich kind of scrubby habitat, which is so vital to so many species. So things like the hawthorn, the blackthorn, the bramble that Mark showed, that is as important as creating some of the more woodland species that you'd more traditionally associate with, I suppose, richer habitat. So this is what it looks like when it's first planted. And this is a couple of years later, showing some saplings. These saplings went in 2 years ago, and many of them are already at chest, if not head height. And you can see also a slight understory starting to develop in terms of the richness of the grass. What's growing there is so much more than the previously, which was this sort of monoculture of ryegrass. So it quite quickly starts to look visually quite different. Next slide, please, Dave. The other thing we've been doing is planting a great deal of hedgerow. And this is showing the hedgerow when it first went in, again, a kind of sea of, or indeed a kind of channel of tubes. It's interesting because hedgerow is, although it's a managed habitat, it's what offers such a rich opportunity for nesting birds and acts as a wildlife corridor for moths and butterflies and insects that reside there. So it's a really great way to connect perhaps larger pockets of habitat and provide that rich habitat. So all in all, putting together the woodland and the scrub and the hedgerow planting, we put in 39,000 saplings. And that is thanks to a number of volunteers, some of whom I think might be sitting here today. And more recently, we've worked with a forestry firm so we can really get the site. Now it's now fully planted as of actually this week. So it feels really good to be in that position. This is some of the hedgerow which went in as those tree tubes. This is 2 years later, already starting to look like a hedgerow. We've got birds beginning to nest in the hedgerow, and we've actually done our first pollarding of it to start to encourage it to thicken out at the base. Next slide, please, Dave. The next really most important thing that we've done is to introduce water. And I would encourage, as Mark has done, any opportunity you have, however small the sort of opportunity to have water, it's really, really vital. So this is a pond which went in just last year. And this picture was taken around September time. So it's not even a year old when this picture was taken. And you can see how quickly it goes from being what was essentially a kind of mud bath when it was first dug to being, the sort of flora surrounding it has really grown up. We've had frog spawn as early as the following spring, and it really looks so mature already. It's such an important thing for not just the things that live there, but of course the birds and insects that are feeding from it as well. Supporting this, we've also included lots of deadwood, so piles of deadwood, standing deadwood where possible. That's really important for all of the species that reside there, not just the visible ones, but the fungi and so on that are living sort of at a level that we can't see, but are so important to the web of life. This is the wildflower meadow. We are fortunate that we do have a field which hadn't been fertilised and the soil isn't rich and actually has the adequate conditions to create a wildflower meadow. So starting off with the yellow rattle that Mark talked about, and then a sort of diverse native mix of wildflowers. And this has taken really, really well and is absolutely humming with life in the summer. And it's just beautiful to see and to walk amongst and see a lot of those species, grasshoppers, butterflies, moths, and so on, and the birds and so on that feed off them. Next slide, Dave. And indeed, those birds have come back in abundance. And to me, one of those magical things to see are the raptors. We've got at least 2 nesting pairs of barn owls that are regularly seen on a daily basis hunting out on the land. We've got nesting buzzards and kestrels. It's lovely to see them. And this summer we had a short-eared owl that was hunting on the fields. And they're a migrant species and are quite unusual in the UK, particularly in Derbyshire. So we were really delighted to see that. And there's obviously enough abundance of food for all of these different species to be supported. I would say largely due to the long grass, which has been, as I said, grown quite quickly. Next slide, please. This picture was taken last spring, and it's one of the sort of quieter areas of the land. And it was lovely to observe the hares are often out. You'll startle them. You kind of get really close to them, and then you startle them, and they'll sort of flee. And we did have they had babies as well, which was fantastic. And it's just so magical to have those moments where you can really connect with the species that are benefiting from the habitats that we're helping to encourage. So I would say that although this is obviously a reasonably light sort of a garden scale, this is a farm scale, there are many things, I'll say each of the things that I've described could be taken into the garden. So we've talked about long grass. There's definitely opportunities to have even just patches of long grass in a garden. There's opportunities for letting areas grow a bit wilder, to plant those areas, encourage a bit of bramble, bring in some hedging if you can. Additionally, water, super important. And if you do have the opportunity, you've got some porous soil, just sow some of that yellow rattle and some wildflowers alongside it, then that's brilliant for the pollinators. So to demonstrate that, we did take this to the RHS Tatton show a couple of years ago with a community border called Weed Thriller. And I think that was the first time the RHS had experienced ragwort being shown on display. So that did shock some, but largely it was really well embraced. And thanks to Sandra's skill, because she's the horticulturalist and worked absolute magic in terms of getting wildflowers to grow in a very artificial environment, we were awarded a gold medal. But more importantly, we had loads and loads of interest in the press and in conversations at Tatton in how people can bring different elements of this to the garden space. So really looking forward to more questions on that later. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Sandra.
I don't think I'll ever not feel like I have the rice. Hello there, I'm Sandra Nock. So I'm here to talk more kind of on a garden scale. I don't garden great big landscapes, I garden gardens. So we could have the next slide. So this is just a little bit about me. I started out growing up on a tiny little allotment in Stoke-on-Trent, had no garden at all of our own, little tiny backyard, but developed an absolute love of growing in very straight lines. My dad was very regimental. Growing and kind of ended up doing botany at university, loved that. Accidentally ended up at Kew in the farmhouse for a short time, which was amazing. Worked in a plant nursery, which I felt gave me a really good understanding of plants and growing. And then after 3 children, I have had the great privilege of working at Soonart to develop the gardens there. I turned up expecting to find a small plot that maybe need a couple of hours a week, but instead found the most perfect garden ever because the landscaping had all been done. There was fresh soil in most of the borders, trees existed, and I was just given kind of free rein to create a relatively naturalistic garden that would help to bring the landscape into the area around the house. Go to the next slide. So a big part of what I've been doing has been unlearning a lot of the things I was taught. Certainly during my traineeship with the National Trust, which was incredible, and I would never undo any of it, but I've had to unlearn a lot of the spraying and the maintenance and the control elements that we're taught to kind of be this kind of dominion over nature and that we're in control. And actually, I've very much gone completely the opposite way. And an approach I like to use now is either a closed loop or a closed system approach, where you consider the garden almost as an island, a separate entity. Everything you need within the garden, you try and create within the garden. So that includes soil, so that's making leaf mould and compost, using comfrey and nettles from within the garden to make fertiliser, saving seeds. Rather than just buying in all of the plants, I do a lot of division and propagation from plants. So I've only been there for 4 years because that's as long as the garden's existed, but I've already done a kind of a mass herbaceous border division and digging things up and spreading around, and it's been a really lovely experience to see the garden kind of sprawling. And again, as Mark's touched on, water is really important in the garden, but also in terms of, as you can see at the top left there, that's my own little greenhouse at home. rainwater harvesting, it just feels so unnatural to be using a hosepipe connector to a tap, and we get it in abundance. So trying to kind of keep all of these elements within the garden in a way that you can kind of close yourself off and not bring in too many unsustainable practices. Next slide, please. So in terms of bringing wildlife into the garden, I mean, it's not a hard job to do when you're surrounded by hundreds of acres of rewilding fields. You don't have to do a lot to encourage wildlife in, but I think one of the principles I follow is something Dave Goulson talks about in the Garden Jungle, which is not to get too hung up in the garden on natives versus non-natives. I try not to go for double flowers. I try to ensure that I'm planting species that have really good nectaries and are providing pollen. I let the ivy flower, because again, a great early pollen source for the bees. It's about colour, it's about scent. It looks beautiful, and it's a garden rather than a wild area. So I do curate and I do control certain elements of it, but there are patches of nettles and there are lots of patches of brambles. And we always use those as a boundary, that the brambles become part of the boundary of the garden. But the 4 elements I'm kind of going to speak about here are the soil, the plant choices, the water, and the food and habitat. And these are the 4 elements that I find help to bring wildlife into the garden. The next slide, please. So soil, the actual soil underneath the ground is really important to understand your soil, but to ameliorate that soil by constantly adding organic matter, introducing plants that might even help feed the soil for you. So as far as possible, I try to use a no-dig system, especially within the kitchen garden at Sunart. So we've got lots and lots of compost bays, which I'm regularly turning on cold days. It's brilliant. But we also are very lucky to live opposite a farm that has vast quantities of horse manure. So we do take advantage of that as well. So I feed the soil from above. We compost everything. My biggest learning curve for the last couple of years has been the use of a shredder. So I shred everything before we add it to the compost base now, and it's sped up the process by at least a year. I can now get compost round in a year. And if I shred the leaves that go in the leaf mould, again, I'm using that within a year now to go straight back onto the borders. And I do leave leaves where they can be left, because they do need to be there to be helping all these little invertebrates to get through the winter. But where I do have to take leaves off, or we're taking produce off, then I'm feeding the soil again with the green manures in the winter. So that's the only time I don't do non-dig, is if I grow green manures, such as Hungarian grazing rye, or my favourite is Phacelia, because 1 or 2 always end up flowering and I get all the bees on those. I do gently dig those in, but apart from that, we tend to just keep it pretty no dig. And in the middle there, that's my garden at home. I live over in Chinley. I have 1 acre of what is ultimately woodland. It has something like 83 trees. We've taken a few out for safety reasons, but every year I get about 10 build-a-ton bags of leaves off there. So yeah, leaf mould isn't in short supply in my life. Next, please. And water, as Rachel and Mark have both touched on, I find water is the #1 way to get wildlife into your garden. I have a son, my 11-year-old son is absolutely obsessed with ponds. We've dug 3 now, and he's trying to persuade me to dig another one. So the pond in the middle there, he was desperate for fish. I'd kept fish out of the other ponds for wildlife reasons, but we gave him a fish pond in lockdown. He dug a hole. And even the fish pond is full of toad spawn, frog spawn, newts. It's just, and then the wildlife pond that's further into the garden, a slightly bigger pond, is just completely full of dragonfly nymphs. And yeah, they like to go out at night time with their head torches to look at the newts kind of swimming around ethereally. It's really beautiful. So on the left here is the pond that we had done at Sunart. So top left is just planting the marginals, and below us, that's 1 year later. So it's very crowded, but the water is crystal clear because we use a lot of oxygenators. But I think the thing with the pond here is to ensure that you've got access for creatures to get into the pond and out of the pond. Cover, so I don't put everything back and keep it neat like you might be tempted to in a garden often. I kind of leave things a little bit more wild. But yeah, frogs galore everywhere. And the one on the top right is the one Rachel showed. And that's one I planted up in a pair of swimming shoes and got in there and planted that up. And it's incredible to see how much it's flowering even only after a year now. Next, please. So food and habitat. So the left here, I think the biggest unlearning I had to do was controlling lawns, because a lot of my time with the Natural Trust, whilst I absolutely loved everything I learned there, was spent cutting grass. edging grass, scarifying grass, removing the moss, removing the weeds, feeding the grass. And I know I don't have grass. I don't have lawns, sorry, I have grass now. So I tend to leave all of my grass to grow. I don't even just do no mow May. I've kind of taken it as an excuse now. I do no mow. No. I cut everything back at the end of the summer in about September. I do tend to, I find certainly in the larger areas of my garden, I cut paths through the grass and I edge all of the paths and the borders. And that just gives it a kind of a purpose and it looks deliberate and people don't just think it's scruffy. My mother-in-law disagrees. But I found since the first year I had our house 5 years ago, I used to manage the lawns. And it's so much more a pleasant environment for myself and for nature now. And then on the right, this tiny little bird feeder is stuck on the kitchen window. We sit about 2 meters away from it and it never stops. I mean, it's literally, there's a bird sat on the hedge and then they queue up from the hedge and they queue up on the light and then they go onto the bird feeder to the apple tree and they just seem to come on constant rotation. But if you can feed the birds as well as providing the habitat for them, I find that's incredible. And then finally there, what is a pest anyway? I don't use any pest control. I don't use any chemicals in any way. I try to garden as organically as possible. So I have used a few natural controls where I brought in maybe pests for the greenhouse to control aphids, but even that now, the balance has all kind of found itself. And I think that's something like Dave Wilson, especially in the gardening for bumblebees, I found it's that kind of, you've just got to trust that things will come and find the things they want to eat. So the prey and the predators, you need them all. I no longer throw the slugs over the neighbour's wall. Birds eat the slugs, the frogs eat the slugs, the toads eat the slugs. It's all kind of it all needs to be there for any part of it to be there. So at Soonart, this is just a quick overview of the food we grow there. So it's not just all about wildlife gardening and nature gardening, but again, I do everything as organically as possible. Bottom left is the kitchen garden as it was 4 years ago, maybe. The bottom right in the centre of what it looks like on a wet summer day, which is mostly what it is. We tend to have a lot of wet sunny days. But we've been really lucky to even garden at the kind of the height on the side of a hill in Whaley Bridge with the wind and the snow, but mostly the wind. It's been a real pleasure. It's been a learning curve, but I think starting from fresh with borders where the soil was completely fresh, in my head, that was the perfect starting point. And then I very quickly realised actually there was very little fertility in the soil. So I've had to spend quite a long time feeding the soil and getting the worms into the actual kitchen garden borders. But I think we're slowly developing a system. Rachel's still not fond of the broccoli because I can't control the caterpillars. Apart from that, I think we're doing really well with kind of harvesting, given the height. It's been brilliant. It's been really good to see. Next, please. And then finally, the other thing I grow there is flowers. So this area here on the left is an area I call the wild weedery. But throughout the garden, I do use non-natives, lots of non-natives within the garden. But where possible, when I'm planting a hedge, I'll use natives. Certainly on the boundaries of the garden, I'm using natives. But the amount of species of bee and moth and butterfly, my favourite on the sage flower a couple of years ago, I had a hummingbird hawk moth. I could have watched that for hours. It was amazing. I'd seen them in Greece previously, but I'd never seen them in Britain. So I was really, really touched with that. So I think my take homes are let it go a bit. I'm not going to do an Elsa from Frozen, but just receive control a little bit and nature will do what it needs to do to kind of find the balance. That means you get to enjoy the beauty of it, but also cultivate and curate and find your own style, your own way of bringing these things in. But the elements of the water, the plant choices, so choosing plants that are beneficial to wildlife as well as being beautiful. And then just, sit back and enjoy. Thank you. It is. And now for something completely different. This is a view from Axe Edge.
looking down the valley to Crone Hill, High Wealden, some of you may recognise it, or maybe at least 7 of you recognise it. And this is our house here. And we have a couple of meadows.
Jill, you might just want to pull your mic down closer to you.
Yes, dear.
Yeah.
And we have a steep valley either side of us, so the weather just comes off axe edge and hits us. So we're very exposed, 1,500 feet above the tree line. It's very challenging. Next slide, please. Living on this hilltop, we do have extreme weather. The extremes can be wind, can be rain, can be snow. This was taken last winter. The snow just blows in off the fields and fills the dry stone walls, and we get snowed in for a couple of days, which is very exciting. But if the fridge is full, the freezer's full, it's okay. None of the trees grow straight, they all lean. Yes, next please. So 26 years ago almost, we bought this house. It's in a lovely location, but it didn't have any shelter at all from the weather. So we decided we needed to create some sort of a shelter belt to slow the wind down. It wasn't going to stop the wind, but maybe slow it down, protect the house a bit more, maybe help us create a garden. So we put in, however many trees, we put in rowan and Norwegian maple down the side of the house. The rowans did fine, the Norwegian maple just couldn't hack it, it was obviously too windy. Gradually the rowans have grown very slowly. We have a shorter growing season. We filled in with other natives. This is a dwarf sycamore. It wasn't dwarf, but it is dwarf because of where it's growing. We filled in with natives. There's some deciduous, there's some conifers, just to give a bit more of a break. The conservatory blew away once, just a second one. But anyway, we managed to cover that area along the side of the house, which has given us privacy from the lane, but also given us some shelter. We've got log piles in there, we've got leaf mold, but not very tidy. Next please. We did have a garden when we moved in, but it was just a structure of a wall with a sunken bit, paving slabs on the top deck there, not much in the way of plant life. So I took all the paving slabs out and we dug out around so that we extended it. Again, native trees around that to give it shelter. Put in a lot of hardy perennials. Some of them did really well, some of them didn't do so well, some of them just blew away. And I try and have things that are in flower for as long as possible. So maybe I can start with maybe February with maybe some pulmonaria lungwort, going down to maybe hardy geraniums that maybe will be October, November. Some plants do okay, some plants don't do okay, but these are some of the things that come into the garden. Next please. We also dug a pond. We don't have any natural springs, we don't have a river or stream because we're on top of a hill. So we dug out a big hole, or we had to dig it actually, lined it, and it's deep enough that it manages to survive any dry weather. Like Sandra said, it's got a gradual slope on one side so things can crawl out if necessary, and then a plant shelf around the other side. We didn't do anything with it, we just allowed it to grow wild, so things have come into it. We've planted odd trees around the outside, but a lot of that stuff has just come on its own. Somebody did give me a water lily, and I thought, well, let's try it. And it did actually do all right once it was finished blowing around from side to side. The way I managed to split it a couple of years ago, so it's done really well. Next slide, please. These are some of the things that live in and around the pond. There are a lot more things, but I've only got 10 minutes. So, yeah, we have all of those things. All of those things obviously bring in other things.
Yeah, we're very chuffed at watching newts. Next slide, please. And then we have, beyond the pond, we have hay meadows. And back in 1996, before we moved in, a survey was done and 46 plant species were recorded. Before we moved in, the meadows were grazed by a couple of horses. So when we took over, horses went. We repaired the stone walls, we put in fences, we installed gates to prevent the local free range animals coming in. And we had a lot of them when we first moved in. And gradually over time, another survey in 2019 identified 79 plant species, and that has gone up again. Next slide, please. Obviously, Evatt is brilliant, and I don't have to tell you anything about that because Mark and Rachel have told you that very much. What we do have, last year we found a moonwort. This is a little fern. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of moonwort. Quite rare. The alchemilla also is quite unusual. Quaking grass, one of my favourite grasses. Quacking grass to suit. We also have, next slide please. We also have various orchids. When we first moved in, we had the tway blade, these here. And it was always a little bit disappointing when I saw them because I thought, oh, I've missed it. It's green, it's gone over, but that's what it looks like. And gradually, over the years, with it being protected, with it being left alone, we've got common spotted orchid, southern marsh orchid, and the greater butterfly orchid. The common spotted and the southern marsh do tend to hybridize, so you end up with some quite interesting leaf patterns. The spots go and the stripes come, or no spots. But the meadows are really prolific with orchids. There are a lot of orchids in there. Next slide, please. These are just some of the things that visit the meadows, feeding the meadows, live in the meadows. We are surrounded by moorland. We've got axe hedge next to us. And around the edges of the meadows, there are bilberries, there are moorland species. So we do get the bilberry bumblebee coming in. Also, we get lots of voles, so the kestrel is very interested. Quite proud that we have a woodpecker because we are built above the tree line. But that comes into the garden quite a lot. The hares come into the garden. The curlews tend to feed in the meadows before it grows up. So, and I always love curlew. Next. Once the grass has grown up, it is mown, and that is baled and that is taken away. And come October, November time, when things cool off, these wonderful fungi come out. These are wax caps on this side, and on the other side we've got some corals. This one here is a violet coral, and it is incredibly rare, and we have a few of those. So that's something to be quite chuffed about. We've had a couple of surveys done, fungi surveys, and we are internationally important for grassland fungi. So, okay. Next. Oh, so I can't really. I just don't want to say what you've already said. Just let it go wild. Don't be too precise. Don't be too tidy. I'm a very lazy gardener. The only thing I sort of take more care about is my veg garden. I didn't realise we were going to do veg garden. So yeah, if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, but if you created something that's naturally and wild, things will come. Things came from our pond. The meadow is just done fabulously well, and our garden looks really nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, all four of you. Obviously some similarities, but also really lovely to see the contrast between what you're doing as well. While you go and have coffee and biscuits, please can you think up lots and lots of interesting, challenging tricky questions, or just some very straightforward, easy questions that you'd like to ask the panel.
Or reflections on what you yourselves have done that add to
Yeah.
these things as well.
Yes, thank you. Or that too. Okay, so question time, and we'll pass the mic along to whoever is answering the question. So hopefully you'll all be able to hear well enough. If you can put your hand up to ask the question, and then ask it as loudly as you possibly can, because obviously we don't have a mic for the audience. Okay,
But you repeat the question.
I will repeat the question, Mark. Yeah, I think it's marvellous. I've got the voices. So I don't even have to say them out loud. Mark does it for me. Right, who would like to ask a question? Karen.
Yeah, it's for Jill then. I'm just interested in the pond really. How deep is the pond that you've dug? And did it just fill from rainwater then initially?
Okay, so did everybody just hear? It's about Jill's pond. How deep is it? And did it fill from rainwater initially? I feel like I'm singing to you, Jill.
Hello, is it Karen?
Yeah.
We just left the tap on and went to bed.
So you filled it with.
Initially, we did that, yeah,
And then
it just keeps, yeah, so it's,
And
how deep is it? Excuse me,
It's a meter.
it's a metre deep,
Oh, it'd be a meter, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you.
a bit more than a metre.
Okay.
Just ask
Just
other
a
views on
comparison, I suppose, is kind of interesting because so we've got we didn't line our ponds, so it's interesting to hear the different approaches. But what we did do is using a digger to kind of get down to the clay layer and then use the clay to kind of compact against the sides of the pond, so that forms a membrane. The deepest pond is sort of, the deepest point is kind of a couple of meters, and then as you say, it's got like kind of shallow edges and things. But it wouldn't have been possible to fill with tap water, so we just let them fill, and it was surprising with the rain in Whaley Bridge how quickly that happens. It was more or less the same rate, I think, overnight. And the levels do ebb and flow quite a bit, but that's okay actually. That's quite good, because exposing muddy banks at times is fine, because it's good for certain creatures. House martins, we've got house martins nesting, and they're obviously taking the mud from the banks when they're exposed. So that's one of the benefits, I suppose, of taking that approach. But it's just compare and contrast.
Clear, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, is it Charlie? I think.
Just following up on ponds, not something that hasn't been mentioned, but do you have any tips on controlling mare's tail or horsetail? I don't know, I had a small patch of it on the edge of my pond for 15 years. And then 2 summers ago, it suddenly grew a metre high and surrounded the pond.
Okay,
It
so
spread horribly.
so that's any hints of control of mare's tail around the ponds, please? Any takers on that?
No idea. I mean, it's interesting why it should be bad. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't think why it suddenly jumped up, but I think the only way I've ever control mare's tail is just to exhaust it. You've just got to pull. Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. I can hear my own voice now. That's weird though. Yeah, you've just got to exhaust it by pulling, which is, yeah, when it's completely surrounding the pond, is really tricky to do.
Yeah.
And then maybe planting so densely that it can't quite run away.
I have had some success with just cutting it, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean the roots go down so far because it just snaps, doesn't it? So if you can get your hands just beneath the soil and pull as much as you can there, you tend to be able to pull, but you'll never get the roots out. And yeah, maybe learn to love mare's tail.
Andrea?
Yellow rattle. So this is my 4th year in trying to grow yellow rattle in our community orchard in Minster. And this year I got the seed from Hartington with the in the fridge. When are you putting it on your grass?
Okay, this is a yellow rattle question. When are you putting the seeds out? Is that right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
having just said I've chilled them for 3 months. 4 months.
Okay, so ready chilled seed, when do they go out?
Well, I just think it has to have frost, but I used to plant mine in the summer, sort of late autumn, September, October. You know, when things have stopped growing, you can scatter the seed over the land. But I mean, if you can get a single yellow rattle plant growing, you can simply slowly over the years just keep expanding, sprinkling the seed as it sets itself. So once you've got a few plants, you can, you know, intervene to increase and spread it. I mean, if you really want a yellow rattle, if you want no lawn and you just want yellow rattle, and you're spreading large quantities of seed, then I would have done it in the autumn and mown it to the quick. So you cut the grass till it's really hammered. And that's what I did. And it's always been successful.
Other hints?
Just one other tip that we were given, which I don't know if it is helpful, is to then make sure it's kind of fully trodden in. So on when we established the wildflower meadow, we didn't actually go through the full regime that plant life talk about, where you kind of fully take rid of everything that's there. We just harrowed, we scattered the seed, and then we have some livestock, just a small number of sheep, and they tread it in. And I think that action is actually can be quite helpful. And again, with sort of timing wise, it was the autumn time that the seed was spread, but I have heard that you can also put it in around now actually. So yeah, I think there's a couple of selling points.
I call it the yellow rattle dance, where you dance on the, you know, you dance around stamping it into the ground. I mean, just to sort of, as Rachel says, just to make sure it gets to the soil and can dig down.
Can we get a video of that?
Yeah, I was going to say there's going to be a video of Mark doing that just to show you how it's done. Yes. Next question, please. Emily.
I'm just wondering about the micro scale. So what if you have like a really, really tiny garden, maybe just like a couple of square meters or something like that, what would be, and this is for kind of everybody, what would be your recommendations for bringing as much nature as you can into that tiny space?
Okay, so that's recommendations for bringing as much nature as you can into a tiny space. You'd like
Pots. 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 You can have a pond in a pot. You can have a pot going wild. Pots. Yeah, so you can have a pot with water in it. You can have a pot with flowers in. You can get bee mixes. You can get all sorts of things. You can have a pot that just goes wild, window boxes. You don't have to do things on a great big scale. You just need to be willing to let it go a bit. Does that help?
I think also, as well as thinking about the size of the space, go up. You need all of the levels, but you know, wildlife. So if you can just put a lilac in the pot, gives you the height and the flowers that bring your bees in, then or maybe if you've got space for a small tree in a pot, do it. But if not, just consider as much of the space as possible. And anything growing tall, you can get fine going up that. So yeah, think about up as well as out, and you've probably got a lot more space than you realise.
And I would say embrace some of the wild native species in amongst it. So don't be afraid to have a few nettles and thistles and, you know, things like that in amongst some of the more cultivated flowers, because they'll make a big difference. And I would also say don't use any chemicals, because just try and rely on a natural balance. It's really important even on a small scale.
Don't underestimate the value of a dandelion.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, you know, the ridiculous thing is that I was talking to somebody in Buxton and they were very worried about their apple trees, and they were cutting all the nettles down around the apple trees. The number of insects that occupy apple trees is about 15. The number of insects that rely upon nettles is well over 50. In fact, I think there are about 50 micro moths that need nettles. So, you know, all these plants are incredibly important, and it's about just what everybody said, but Sandra, you know, taking your boot off the neck of nature is just all you need to do to get wildlife, I think, very often.
I think also, just to put my 2 pennies in, we've got a very small garden as well, and I just find that you can have endless room, because if you follow Jill's idea of pots, you can always get another pot in somewhere, and then another one and another one, and you know, and also to plant much more compactly, you know, don't leave big spaces between your plants, just plant everything you can and leave everything that grows in between, I think, and that's made a big difference in our garden. Sorry, next question.
The little ladder.
Yeah, there's a boy at the back in a yellow top, and then I'll come back to you, sir. Sorry, I can't hear you, I'm
I
afraid.
can, something about mushrooms.
Oh, yeah.
Does anybody know much about mushrooms? We've got a fungal walk. We've got a walk for looking at mushrooms in the autumn, we hope. So we expect you to come with us and show us what we're going to see.
From like wild and then getting the spores and then taking them, and then like if you want grown in your garden at home or like
Yes. So the gentleman said if you wanted to get oyster mushrooms very common and abundant around Buxton. There's a big showing of them at Lightwood Road on the right hand side if you go up, but they're all over our area and you can eat them and they're fantastic to eat. And I presume that's what you're interested in, is harvesting them to eat them, is it? Just to have them? Yes, I don't know. Or maybe we can ask Merlin Sheldrake, who's the wonderkind on mushrooms.
Yeah, you can buy kits that you keep in the fridge, and I've had one in the fridge for 3 years that I bought for my husband, and he's not done it, and I refuse to do it for him because it's a gift. And it's a little, they send these little tiny vacuum packed, impregnated. They look like the end of a pencil, and the idea is that you take a freshly cut log, you drill holes in, and then you pop these little spore impregnated pencil ends in, and then as the log starts to die, the fungus will take over.
but like I want to like do it with like wild ones, but I've like made my own ones, but like not actually got them.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you would do that, because obviously what we see of a fungus is just the fruiting body. That is, you know, what we see as the mushroom is just a tiny part of the whole. But if you could maybe, with permission from the landowner, take a log, you might be better off taking a whole ecosystem, part of an ecosystem, than, you know, you've got the whole being then, rather than just the fungus.
Okay, thank you. Yes, good to hear.
Yeah, I very much appreciate this idea of just letting things go. It has an inherent appeal. But we, in this same community orchard that we're trying to get the yellow rattle to take, the problem was that it's an old village tip that was landscaped. We put a community orchard on part of it. But it was poor soil, and it's characterized by coarse grass and hogweed. And if you just leave coarse grass and hogweed, you create a hogweed jungle about 5 foot high, which goes to seed, and you get nothing else in there. So we've got, and we've tried different mowing regimes and so on. We've got hints about how we can encourage everything else except the hog.
Thank you. Okay, so hints for how you stop hogweed taking over. Yeah.
Well, Rachel should add. I mean, I should just say, hogweed is it's sensational for insects.
So I'm not no culture of hogweed is not.
Well, but I have a lot of hoverfly friends who really disagree with that. But I'm going to leave it to Rachel. I mean, you might have to do something to intervene.
You got space for beavers?
Well, yes.
So I think it kind of gets to this point of like rewilding and the scale of rewilding, and you know, at a very large scale, which is considered to be over 500 hectares, one can leave things to be and things will form an absolutely natural balance, because there's enough of a sort of impact from apex predators, from herbivores coming and going at the right rate, that it would get such things as hogweed into proportion. However, obviously that requires enormous scale. So anything below that, you are intervening to replicate what will be happening in nature. So the human is doing the act for that. And even on the scale that we're operating, we consider a small holding in rewilding terms. And so we have to do a certain amount of intervention and acting like either herbivores or beavers, or in some cases apex predators, to try and get things in the sort of balance that would be in nature. So when it comes to the hogweed, my advice would be to embrace some of it, because you want some of it in balance. But in other cases, you're going to have to put in some manual effort probably to cut it, take that material away, otherwise it will be kind of enriching the soil. And unfortunately, it does involve a certain amount of person power. I wouldn't be tempted, ideally, if you can avoid it, to get the spray out, because that will, on an even smaller plot, have other impact. So I don't think there's a very quick answer, unfortunately. But it's over time. Hopefully, you should find, if you've got other things in its place, they will take over a bit more if they're happy to grow there, and things could get into more of a natural balance. But having the poor soil is a benefit, actually. Having the, the ex-tip, it's great, because wildflowers in theory should thrive on that kind of environment.
I do have hogweed in my garden too. I basically have an acre of ground elder sprinkled with hogweed, surrounded by really tall skinny trees. It's beautiful. But I find when it's kind of just green and it's got a little bit of substance to it in late spring, early summer, you can pull it out quite successfully. Just do not let it set seed. Just, if all you can do is go and cut those flower heads off before they set to seed, if that's the only labour you have available, do that. That would be my number one. But do pull them up. It's a bit like when you go and pull up Himalayan balsam. It's really satisfying when it actually works. But yeah, it's that maybe if it is poor soil, it probably will need a bit of help from a fork, but you can generally get that root out quite well. Yeah, perseverance.
So just on the note of Himalayan balsam, that's our nemesis. We have a lot of Himalayan balsam that, despite trying to, well, we are getting on top of it. There was absolutely loads when we first took the site on. And of course it comes in the waterways, it comes in the air, but through the active, just, person power, repeatedly pulling it, we've really weakened it. So we're keeping on top of it that way, getting on top of it before it sets seed.
Thank you. Another question? Yeah, Pam?
Yeah, I have done the normal me thing to June, July, August, etc. for a few years now. And it is not a very big area of grass, we don't call it a lot anymore, but it is the devil's own job to cut it. The fly mold just munches it, and so I end up doing it with shears. Has anybody tried a strimmer? Would I have to invest in a strimmer, do you think?
So you're asking about cutting of an area?
The best way to cut the normal me lawn.
Yeah, okay, the best way to cut the no-mow May lawn.
When
which
it's
is
really
like a
grown up.
contradiction in terms, yes, okay.
Yeah. Well, you have to cut it at the end of the summer.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, you essentially want to, if you want diversity in your lawn, you want to reduce fertility. And so therefore you want to take the cuttings off. I mean, any of these relatively cheap, depends on how big the area is, but relatively cheap electric mowers should, with persistence, grind through it just very slowly. Well, you can just, once you've cut one avenue, you just
a whole week to cut it, and it really isn't very big.
Okay, how big is it? How big is it?
Not big. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's probably about 6 or 7 strides one way and 6 or 7 strides the other. It really isn't very big.
Yeah, I would just, well, I mean, we have a similar patch and I just very slowly cut it, but I don't find it too difficult.
If you want to come and help.
I would say take up that lady's offer to borrow a strimmer. Absolutely. Yeah, you don't need to buy a strimmer, just you're only going to need it for 1-2 days a year. Strim it, leave it for a couple of days for the seeds to do their thing, so you're getting the same plants coming back in again, and then just rake it up. Get rid.
I always get rid of it all. And is it, I mean, should I do it September?
Yeah, yeah, I tend to do mine kind of towards the end of September.
Yeah, well, that's what
Only once the kids are back at school and I've got time to actually look at my garden. But that's fine. I think as long as you're not leaving the the cuttings there as nutrients.
It's just, it's for that time of year, it's very wet,
It-
you know, it never dries
yeah.
out and.
And it's also, it's quite woody and it's wet and things are thick, so no, I would definitely go strimmer first.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
And just on the point of strimmers, can I just say that, I don't know whether they've got one, but Transition Buxton have got a library of things.
Oh.
And so people are going to donate stuff, so if you want to borrow it, machines, so. If I move, Pam, I might well donate my strimmer to the library of things, but I'll lend it to you first. But you know, just so people know that there is that.
Okay, thank you. Another question? Yep, over here.
Can I just add on the strimming, that it's worth walking through the area, just so that any frogs and things like that get out of the way.
The frogs,
We'll start in the middle, if you
Yeah.
can, if you're doing a circle or a square, start in the middle and they've got time to get.
My other question was, we work in the community garden of the art centre in Leek. And there's a bee hotel, that's so called, that's been there for about 10 years, put up by Staffordshire Wildlife Trust. It's got a cedar roof, it's starting to lean, and it also is looking tired. And we're wondering what time of year is it best to disturb it? And to replace and replenish some of the wood. Replacing.
Okay, thanks, Penny. So it's what time of year is the best time if you're going to start mending a bee hotel? Yep.
Oh, I mean, whenever you intervene, you're going to do some, but does it have bees in it?
Yes.
Do you know what species of bee it's got? No, you don't know. I mean,
Solitary, very solitary.
yeah, solitary bees, okay. Would it be leaf-cutted bees? I'm not absolutely sure, but do they mature and fly at any particular time?
Don't know, they don't seal the holes with leaves, they seal them with clay.
We see it with clay, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I can research when the young fly, if I could find out what they are. I'm in Moorland Climate Action, so I can ask. And then you could just repair it. But I mean, you know, yeah, we'll try and find a time that will do the least damage. But I mean, as long as you repair it and the population recovers, I think, you know, one can't be too precious about it, as long as the main objective is to increase the bee population. But I mean, maybe a bit of constructive damage is what you need to do. But I'm not absolutely sure, but I'll research it.
You can take, if it's possible to take the cocoons out, you can put them in a pot and just put them somewhere cold and then keep an eye on them, and they'll hatch out of there. And we've done that in the past. It's, you know, if you can actually open the bee hotel up, that's one way of doing it, and then you can just render it as you want then.
Thanks, Steve. Any other views on bees? No? Okay.
I think one thing to do is to let the one they got rot into the ground and build a new one next to it.
Okay.
And then we'll gradually just transfer it.
Let it rot and get another one, Penny. Thank you.
Is it really full of bees? Has it got hundreds and hundreds of? No. I wouldn't worry about it. I'd just take it out and put it back in. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Another question? David.
It's one for Rachel, I think. It's about good neighbours. I love ragwort. I'm working to restore a bit of churchyard to a wildflower meadow, and ragwort keeps coming up, but unfortunately my farmer neighbour doesn't really like it. How do you cope with that? You know, it's great wildlife habitat, but farmers hate the stuff.
Right.
He just wants me to pull it all out.
So the question is, how do you manage to keep ragwort and stay friends with your next door neighbour farmer?
Yeah, well, I guess there's no kind of magic bullet to this, but you know, one thing is, I suppose you want to try and have it in balance within your plot, so it's not just ragwort, but there is some ragwort and there's plenty of other things.
So maybe it's a case of demonstrating that you're doing something, but not going so far as to eliminate the species. Yeah, neighbourly relations, it's an interesting one really, because I think within, we taken on a farm, and we have farming neighbours, and they do things differently, and no doubt some are more vocal with their opinions than others. But I'm not sure you're going to necessarily convert everyone. So in some cases it's about being shown to sort of stick to your guns. You're managing it, you're keeping things in balance, but at the same, and you're being respectful of their views, but at the same time not conceding to doing things in the way that others do, because you've got your own principles to stick to. And I think, we found by doing that and being kind of assertive, we're comfortable with the way we're managing things and the rationale. We're respectful of our neighbours, but it doesn't mean conceding to their views entirely. And in some cases, it's doing things which they totally disagree with. It's so far, we get on as neighbours. We're not necessarily best friends, but it's a respectful relationship.
Jill, do you have ragwort? Yes, I was wondering if.
Well, unfortunately, our meadows are a crop, and they are taken away and fed to horses and cows. So we leave the ragwort to flower, and then we will remove it before we are mown. And that could be the end of July, but last year it was the end of August. So we realise the importance of the ragwort, and we will leave it for as long as we possibly can. And if it's not in the meadows, it will get left. We will leave it standing. If it is in the meadows, then we do need to respect our people who take our bales, because you can't see ragwort in a bale of hay. You can only see it when it's standing.
So you let it flower and cut it before it seeds?
We let it flower and we pull it out.
Oh, right.
But it's a biannual, so it's maybe got less, but it's never going to be eliminated. We've got some coming one year that not. So.
I'm just going to say, ragwort is only really dangerous to animals once it's wilted. They often won't eat it, and it's an accumulative zoonotic poison. So really, it's only dangerous to horses because cows don't live long enough for the poison to accumulate in the liver. But it's really important that horses don't eat the wilted. Because it will kill.
It will kill them. Yeah. So we have to be respectful of the people who take our bales.
But maybe sort of bit of education to farmers who are farming cows, who say even if their cows eat it, the cow does not live long enough for the poison to affect it.
Well, we also have neighbours who realise that, and we wouldn't have to pull it out if they had it. He has cows and sheep, and they're fine with ragwort, because cows, well, obviously sheep, will just eat anything indiscriminately. So when it's very young, it'll just be eaten. So heavily grazed pasture doesn't tend to have ragwort.
It is a bugger to get rid of them.
Another question? Rowan, there.
I have a field/bog that is right on top of the roaches. So very similar to your problems. If it doesn't get blown away, it drowns. But I mean, I'm not going to be there for that long. But I'd love to do something that was kind of impactful, that kind of like I could it's my dad's land, that I could educate him to kind of keep in. Do any of you have like a quick win tips, something I could do that would make an impact, that necessarily doesn't need his expertise to keep in and keep managing it, but just something that could make a bit of a difference, other than my idea to dig a pond and hope that he just leaves it alone.
So this is ideas for quick wins on high bog land. Is that
field? Half bog.
Okay, field,
wind alley.
half bog, half wind alley. Okay.
What sort of things do you have growing there at the moment?
Mostly marrow grass.
Yeah, he goes in probably 4 or 5 times a year and just trims everything to kind of make it look neat. He did get like a, you know, I think it was the National Trust will send you out tree saplings if you have like a certain amount. He put them in, and what didn't blow off is now leaning and only about this tall. They've been in for about 5 years. So
That patch of land that's next door to the.
You
Winking
speak up
Man
because
Club.
the audience can't hear you.
The patch of land that's next door to the Winking Man Club.
yeah.
And it's very, very wet.
So is it between Royal Cottage and Winking Man or on the other side of the
It's on the
road?
junction.
This
It's
one?
you coming from the Leek and the, you know, you come to the junction, the Winking Man's there, there's a house on that corner.
Yeah.
So it's the land that kind of sits between there and the Winking Man, like the Winking Man pub. There's like a field at the back that goes down.
Has it got grass on it?
Yeah,
Is it grey?
Yeah, it's not great.
It's not great.
It's just trimmed
Right,
multiple times a
okay.
year.
Followed by your dad.
Okay, we've got to persuade him to stop
Stop
trimming. And then you can see what is there.
Yeah.
One is a nice idea. Do you have a lot of rush?
No.
No. Do you have any moorland space? Is it acid soil?
Honestly, don't.
No. Have
Yeah,
you got any,
my
have
idea-
you got heather on
We
there?
don't have any heather.
No over it, so it's grass.
Yeah,
It's all
mainly
grass.
grass, yeah.
It's the very coarse, I used to call it marron grass, the one that grows in bogs, the really thick.
So it's probably, does it have, oh, it probably doesn't even get to flower, does it? Because it sounds like it could be like common cotton grass.
Yeah.
Which if obviously could allow to flower would be beautiful.
Yeah. And we just get straight.
Trimmed, yeah.
Constantly.
And what sort of trees have you got on?
Yeah,
Right.
and there's a couple of conifers that they're actually doing okay. Like they're the only ones I've blown over.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest two things. I would plant, if you can, plant some trees, but I put on birch and sallow. Those are the two most important trees for biodiversity in Britain, other than the 2 oaks. And if they take, which they should do, and sallow grows abundantly on Goldsitch and places like that. So it should survive. It's a fantastic plant for, and he wouldn't have to do anything. And, you know, he would just have to sort of avoid it and trim it up, and it grows very quickly as well. So you could burn it if you had a wood burner. But that's what I do. I plant some trees. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with both of those answers. I would let things grow so you can see what's there, and reduce the cutting regime right down to, you know, once a year at most. And absolutely, I was going to say, if it's boggy, if it's wet, if it's damp, then sallows absolutely love that. So different types of willow, they grow phenomenally quickly. They might need some management depending on how big the plot is, because they can take off, but absolutely brilliant habitat. Birch and rowan, they survive really well at quite exposed high altitude. You often see them as like the lone tree growing on top of the moorlands. So they're pioneer trees, so they are the ones that make way for other woodlands. So absolutely, they're the things to plant, and they can withstand quite gusty weather. And agree with the pond idea if possible.
And I would just say with the pond, you need some kind of corridor access to the pond. You don't just want a barren site with a pond in the main, you're not going to get a lot. But I would say if there's an opportunity to plant a shelter belt of just hedging, just buy a load of bare root hedging, plonk it in at much denser rate than is recommended if you feel like you're going to lose it all to the wind or to the wet, and put as much around the site as possible, but also down to the pond. But I think I agree. Tree, water, hedges, trees, water.
Just 2 more questions. So next question. Yes, Mary.
It isn't a question, it's a statement. Here's the girl who was on our place. We had 2 or 3 acres of rough grazing, which are sturks. You know what I mean by sturks? Were taken across the river and were grown on that rough grazing. On that rough grazing, there was a bog, fantastic bog, with the most beautiful wildflowers. And here's the naughty girl, with her husband, with her father's permission, picked these wildflowers, took them to school, and we did I was a trial then, we labelled everyone in a little jam pot on the classroom windowsill. That was the best learning curve that any of the children are in myself, because my father had taught me, could learn about the wildflowers at that time. And that is important, because later in life I was able to remember these things. I didn't quite do the same with my classes, but you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Mary, I think you're talking about the importance of people
The bog,
recognising and
yes,
knowing.
and marshland,
Yeah.
flowers, they're beautiful.
Yes.
They all are. Well, let's face it, dandelions are, daisies are, they all are, right? But I'm talking about the bogland flowers.
Any comments, Mark, on that?
Well, yes, I mean, you know, people used to have when I was at school, we used to have a wild,
Nature table.
yes, a nature table, yes, and it was a fantastic way of learning. And I can only say, yes, it was a wonderful thing to do, and you learned so much from it. And sadly, we don't do it so much now, if at all.
I'm saying
Sorry, Andrew, I can't hear you, Andrew. Can I just
Sorry, I said I'm saying nothing.
Yes, a gentleman, Andrew, is saying that there's now coming in a GCSE in natural history, and nature should be more embedded in the core curriculum, and we're all saying yes, great idea.
And a final question before we finish tonight. Sue?
Can I just please forward for not getting rid of wasps in the garden, because they are people. Whenever anybody has wasp nests, they tend to destroy them, and they do a lot of good in the garden. If you've got vegetables, they will keep all the caterpillars off your vegetables, and they're just great pollinators. And I don't think we should be killing them as randomly and as we do.
Okay. Thank you. So to round off, comments on wasps, Sue's making the point that we shouldn't be killing them because they're great in the garden. So perhaps just a comment from each of you on the benefit of wasps.
As the mother of a child who has the biggest fear of wasps in the world, I have to admit we have had a wasp's nest removed. But like everything, is that thing I said about, is the whole web. We need every part of the web for the web to exist. So you can't just remove things at will and hope the rest of the chain survives. So yeah, they're part of everything.
I heard a really interesting Radio 4 debate, bees versus wasps, and at the end of it, the wasps won because they're such brilliant pollinators, and as you say, they eat all these pests that I didn't know about until I listened to this. So I was a fan of wasps. However, as a mother of two young children, I have and having had a wasp nest in our vaulted ceiling in our bedroom and being stung at 3 a.m, I did have to get rid of that one. But we do tolerate wasp nests we've got many, we've had 3 or 4 last season, and we just try and avoid them. So if we know where they are and there are places that we can avoid them, then we try to do that. So I think it's a balance and a tolerant approach.
Yes, Sue, I agree.
Final words, Mark?
Yes, no, it's a great point, a very important point. You know, that these things that we think of as pests often play crucial roles in the overall, you know, relationship between all parts of nature, and we need insect predators just as we need pollinators like bees, which are vegetarians. So yes, I'm a great fan of wasps, and like everybody else, I've had wasp nests in our house and been stung by those wasps, but it's a small price to pay, I think. A small price to pay.
Right, thank you. So thank you to everyone who's asked questions. But thank you, I think, most of all to our panel, both for their presentations but also for their sharing of what they've all been doing in their different ways and their different land holdings. Thank you to everybody who's come tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you as ever to everybody who made biscuits, served tea, washed up, and all that sort of thing. Our next talk is 2 weeks tonight. It was originally advertised as a Zoom talk on slime moulds, but unfortunately the speakers are not well and they've had to cancel. So that's now going to be here, and it's going to be John Beattie talking on his wild adventures. If you've seen John Beattie before, you'll know he's a fantastic speaker. If you haven't seen him before, I'd really recommend it. He's a fantastic photographer and a very entertaining speaker as well. So that's 2 weeks today. But before you go, perhaps you can show your appreciation for the panel and for their fantastic involvement.